Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the member from Cannington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I'd like to welcome former constituents of mine from the Wawota area, Cheryl Weatherald and her son Patrick. Her husband and Patrick's father was an MLA that served in the 60s and 70s, and I'd like them to you and through you ask all members to welcome them here today to your gallery.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to the Government of Saskatchewan to stop the closures at Broadview Union Hospital. These individuals wish to bring to our attention that according to the SHA, it has an inability to provide reliable and consistent physician services in Broadview. The emergency department, along with acute care services, has been regularly closed for an extended period of time. Along the busy Trans-Canada Highway, Broadview Union Hospital provides critical emergency services in case of motor vehicle accidents. Several rural communities rely on Broadview Union Hospital for healthcare services, and the hospital is a key component to the economic vitality of the region. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to stop closing emergency department and acute services at Broadview Union Hospital. This is signed by residents of Broadview and Whitewood, Mr. Speaker. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise again today to present a petition to this Legislative Assembly calling for funding of in vitro fertilization treatments in Saskatchewan. As indicated yesterday, I had committed to sharing some stories of people who have reached out who will be impacted potentially by this by these calls to action. And today I'd like to talk briefly about a young woman in Regina named Hannah. And Hannah recently suffered an unexpected and ruptured ectopic pregnancy, which after emergency life-saving surgery has left her with one less fallopian tube and no ability to grow her family after this. Hannah has asked me to share this story and notes that even with a well-paying job, the ability to grow her family beyond this is well beyond her means. Mr. Speaker, the signatories of this petition do want to draw our attention to the fact that this is not a rare occurrence, and that 1 in 6 in Canada will experience infertility, and that other provinces in the Dominion of Canada have created programs that financially assist individuals and families in growing their families, and that is something I hope we can all agree to here in this House. Mr. Speaker, I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan immediately move to cover the financial burden of up to 2 rounds of IVF treatments for Saskatchewan people experiencing infertility. Mr. Speaker, the signatories of this petition are all from Weyburn, Saskatchewan. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity again to present our petition for pay equity legislation. Mr. Speaker, the skills and requirements associated with women's work are often ignored or undervalued. The chronic undervaluing of women's work has led to the persistent underpaying of jobs associated with women. Those who have signed the petition would specifically like to bring to our attention the following points. That while pay equity advocacy primarily seeks to address gender-based wage discrimination, it must also be mindful of ability, age, identity, and race-based wage discrimination. While the Saskatchewan Human Rights Codes prohibits gender-based compensation discrimination, the complaint-driven process puts no positive obligation on employers. I'll now read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to introduce pay equity legislation. The signatories today reside in Saskatoon. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Regina Alphastone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be on my feet to again present a petition on the Saskatchewan Income Support Program, the new CIS program, which has, of course, pushed people further into desperate circumstances at the height of a fourth wave. The signatories of this petition wish to bring to the government's attention that previous programs covered the cost of utilities. That's no longer the case. That is by far the deepest cut that we see under CIS, but it's not the only one. CIS represents cuts to school supplies, to a disability benefit, and to several other areas which are just quite heartless under the circumstances. Some changes were announced last week. They missed the mark, Mr. Speaker, and so this opposition will continue to present the petition on a daily basis. And the prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully call on the Government of Saskatchewan to restore direct payment of rent and utilities for income support clients. The signatories of this petition, two of them reside in Regina, and one of these individuals is listed as living without a home. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling on the Sask Party government to fix the crisis in our classrooms. Mr. Speaker, I haven't presented one of these petitions for a while, and I, as well as the signatories to this petition, want to remind members of this Assembly that our classrooms have been underfunded for years, including before and during a global pandemic. Those who have signed the petition and members on this side of the House are very grateful and appreciative of the hard work, care, and determination with which all those working in our schools have demonstrated over the last 20+ years. And they and we, Mr. Speaker, want to remind the Sask Party government and the minister that while those working in and around our schools have again rolled up their sleeves and made it work for the sake of our students, especially since this government has downloaded responsibility and let a fourth wave run unchecked. Mr. Speaker, those who signed this petition remind us that our classrooms were complex, too crowded and crumbling even before the pandemic. And this fall, our students and staff went back to school with even fewer resources than they had the year before. We also know, Mr. Speaker, that the budget and the ESSP are currently being drafted, and, Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition would like to see this government, for once, give education the respect and the funding that it deserves. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to fix the crisis in our classrooms by providing stable and adequate funding for publicly funded education in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed the petition today reside in Moose Jaw. I do so present.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today in presenting this petition, calling on the government to designate the West Lawn as the Chief Pipot Cultural Learning Grounds. Chief Pipot was an influential leader for First Nations on Treaty 4 land who brought his fight for treaty rights to a camp at Pile of Bones, located at what is now the Legislative Grounds. In 2018, the Justice for Our Stolen Children camp stood for 197 days on the West Lawn, bringing national and international attention to systemic discrimination of Indigenous people. In 2020, the group Walking with Our Angels walked 630 kilometers to the West Lawn, where Tristan Derosher carried out a grieving ceremony and fast in response to government inaction on suicide prevention. The West Lawn has become a de facto site for Indigenous expression due to its proximity to the Legislative Assembly, and officially designating the site will facilitate the ongoing process of reconciliation. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly call upon the government to recognize the West Lawn of the Legislative Grounds as the Chief Pie Pot Cultural Learning Grounds, a designated site for cultural celebration, education, Indigenous ceremony, and peaceful demonstration. The signatures of this petition reside in Melfort and Melville, Saskatchewan. I do so present.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to the Legislative Assembly calling for the government to improve access to midwifery services in Saskatchewan. As a mother of 4 who has personally benefited from the services of midwives, doulas, and birthing coaches during each of my pregnancies, I can speak firsthand to the importance and value that midwifery care provides to mothers and their families during the prenatal, birth, and postnatal period. I was fortunate to experience a successful home birth for my second child, Monica, after our first child, Katrin, was born by cesarean section due to birth complications. Their births occurred at a time when the profession was unregulated in Saskatchewan and not covered by our public health care system. As you can well imagine, operating in an unregulated environment places an unfair burden on both families and those offering midwifery services in terms of professional qualifications, standards of care, and payment for service. Certainly from my own personal experience, I can attest to the fact that there is a wide spectrum of childbirth needs and preferences that women and their families consider in consultation with their family doctor in this major life event. Families deserve to have choice and agency in their childbirth experience, and midwifery offers high-quality and cost-effective service. I will read the prayer. We, the undersigned, residents of the province of Saskatchewan, wish to bring to your attention the following. Midwifery provides a model of care that is individualized, community-centred, and cost-effective. Wait lists for midwifery care in Saskatchewan are extensive, and many people who wish to access midwifery services are unable to do so. Midwife-facilitated births amount to only 2.9% of babies born in 2019, with demand far exceeding the limited supply of midwives in the province. According to the Canadian Association of Midwives, 53% of people seeking midwifery care in Saskatoon are turned away due to lengthy wait lists. Expanding midwifery services makes sense for pregnant people and families, and it makes sense for our province's fiscal well-being. The residents of Saskatoon have signed this petition and do call on the province and government of Saskatchewan to introduce a post-secondary midwifery training program in the province. I do so here present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. I recognize the member from Saskatoon-Meewasin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honour and thank all of the hard-working Saskatchewan heroes that stepped up and worked tirelessly over the last 24 hours in response to Saskatchewan's first serious winter storm. Through countless highway closures, ice-covered city roads, and power outages across the province, workers and Saskatchewan residents pulled through, and and worked hard to keep people safe. From the Sask Power IVW workers that continue to restore power in northern and rural communities, to the Sask Energy workers who keep our homes warm, to the SaskTel workers who make sure we can connect to each other when we need to know that a loved one is safe, to the countless emergency responders that closed highways and responded to what I can only imagine were many, many calls to service. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you to the community members who went out all night plowing snow or shoveling driveways, making sure that people can get to where they need to go safely. And I want to particularly thank the community of Davidson. What a heartwarming message and display of fine Saskatchewan community spirit that folks in Davidson, I see the member for Arm River nodding along, the folks in that community open their homes to people who are stranded on the highway number 11. It's a great thing to see. Mr. Speaker, I ask that member and all the members to join me in thanking Saskatchewan workers and residents for their dedication to community throughout the storm. It's always inspiring to see how Saskatchewan people come together to keep each other safe.
Recognize the member from Covington-Wadena.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's here, winter in Saskatchewan, and it has come at us with full force. With high winds, blowing snow, and reduced visibility, many of our highways were closed beginning last night and into this morning. As conditions begin to improve, our snowplow and grader operators will be working around the clock to work on the thousands of kilometers of highways cleared. The Government of Saskatchewan operates more than 300 snowplows throughout the province. Snow and ice removal equipment is mobilized before, during, and after storms. Equipment operators are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Make sure to check Highway Hotline before hitting the road. Mr. Speaker, highways are inspected frequently to determine if plowing or salt sand is required for the ice conditions, and highway conditions are reported to Highway Hotline. I'd like to remind members and those watching to have patience while this work is happening, to slow down when approaching snowplows, and to only pass when it's safe. Those folks out on our highways are working hard to get us where we need to go, and we need to and must do our part to make sure they make it home to their families safe and sound. Mr. Speaker, I'd like all members to join me in thanking all highways employees working hard on our Saskatchewan roads. Thank you.
Recognize a member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lawyer I went to school with at McGill lives in Saskatoon, and she reached out to me and asked me to take a moment and share the story of Jean McLeod. Jean was one of the now more than 900 people who has passed away in Saskatchewan due to COVID-19. Her family asked that I read this message into the record on her behalf, and I quote, "Because of Premier Moe and the Sask Party government's lack of public health measures, we lost a beloved family member, Jean McLeod, on October 18, 2021. Jean caught COVID-19 either at an appointment at the hospital or while touring a new retirement residence for her and her husband. You would think that both of these places should be the safest. However, there's no requirement for healthcare workers to be vaccinated in this province, and because of no restrictions on household bubbles, the virus is free to spread even to those with the vaccine." It continues. Jean was fully vaccinated. Full vaccination is something this government only began mandating in some places this fall, several months after the vaccines were available to all of us. Jean suffered terribly in the hospital trying to catch her breath, and she died alone. Jean McLeod was someone who was loved and someone who died at the hands of this government. The message ends there, Mr. Speaker, and I ask all members to reflect on Jean's unnecessary death and the grief of her family.
Recognize the member from Cut Knife Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I am honoured to congratulate 4 well-deserving constituents on their Rivers West District 2021 Volunteer Recognition Awards. Asby Whitecalf, recipient of the Artist of the Year Award, has been busy beautifying the Battlefords by painting murals that represent Indigenous peoples and culture. Asby has plans to continue a freelance art career in her home community of Sweetgrass Reserve. Velma Foster from Payton is the recipient of the Historical Preservation Award and dedicates much of her time to the Brasiler Museum. Velma is an in-house artist and curator of the museum who spends countless hours collecting, preserving, cleaning, and providing guided tours. Mary Ramsey from Cutknife is the recipient of the Overall Volunteer of the Year Award and is the longest member of the Saskatchewan Senior Fitness Association Board. Tirelessly, she volunteers and organizes many events for various organizations in the Cutknife area. Melvin Sawatsky from Cutknife is the recipient of the Overall Volunteer Award and has been recognized for his years of service as a volunteer firefighter, counselor for the town of Cutknife, along with many other local organizations. Celebrating volunteers that go above and beyond each and every day to keep sport, culture, and recreation in our province is simply one way to show our appreciation. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all members of this Assembly join me in congratulating Asby, Velma, Mary, and Melvin on their awards. Thank you for all that you do to help keep our Saskatchewan communities great. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Regina Walsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm pleased to rise and celebrate a great event that I had a chance to partake in recently, Swinging with the Stars. Now, over the last 18 months, we know how difficult it has been for charities to raise money through in-person events. But, Mr. Speaker, Swinging with the Stars is the biggest fundraiser for Hope's Home. And after having to cancel their 2020 show and do a major pivot this fall, I have to tell you, they pulled it off with a wildly entertaining evening. Hope's Home creates opportunities through support for children with complex medical needs, typically developing children and their families in our community. Now, the event is based off the popular TV show, and it pitted 7 pairs of Regina's most influential celebrities, paired up with a professional dancer, to compete for the Judge's Choice Award. I'm going to keep you in suspense here. Major kudos to Hope's Home founder Jackie Tischer and event organizer Kelsey Stewart for doing a fantastic job this year. This year's event raised over $100,000 for Hope's Home. And might I add that my partner Danny Fontaine and myself were able to win the Judge's Choice Award. I want to thank the judges, Chief Evan Bray, Pam Klein, and Zach Evans, and everyone that came out and supported such a wonderful event. I ask all members to please join me in congratulating Hope's Home and Swinging with the Stars for a great night that will have a long-lasting effect on our community.
Recognize the member from Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize Chelsea Mitchell, Prince Albert's 2020 Terry Fox Award recipient. At age 12, Chelsea was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Because her body didn't respond after 3 rounds of chemotherapy, her family moved to Calgary for 4 months of further treatment. There she would endure 7 days of intense chemotherapy and radiation before receiving a peripheral blood stem transplant. Since 2014, Chelsea has been cancer-free and unstoppable. She fundraises for the Small But Mighty group, the Terry Fox Run, and Relay for Life. Chelsea and her mum meet with and provide encouragement to the families of children diagnosed with cancer. She collects pop tabs to raise money for childhood cancers and is an advocate for improved treatment and care for young patients. Chelsea is pursuing a Bachelor of Science with the hope of one day working in healthcare, where she can use her experience to make life better for children going through similar struggles. In the meantime, she will continue fundraising in the hope there will be better treatment options and eventually cures. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in recognizing and congratulating Chelsea Mitchell, a truly deserving recipient of the Terry Fox Award. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize Victims and Survivors of Crime Week. This week calls to attention the programs, services, and legislative provisions that support victims of crime. Mr. Speaker, this government would like to recognize and offer our appreciation to the people who give their time and energy in supporting victims. Thank you to the staff and volunteers who work in police-based victim services. This is an invaluable service to our province. These are outstanding citizens who attend to the front lines of emergencies and offer support and background, helping people as they heal and navigate through the justice system. It is also a time to highlight the needs of victims and their families. These are people in our communities who have experienced hardship due to criminal activity. I would like to offer my sympathies and commend you for your strength. Mr. Speaker, there are support services across the province that can help connect them to resources. Individuals can reach out to victim services programs in their areas. There's also information on the Government of Saskatchewan website. Mr. Speaker, I now ask all members to join me in recognition of Victim and Survivors of Crime Week and the extraordinary work done by our victim services volunteers across the province. Thank you.
Question carried. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're joined again in the Assembly today by Kirsten Finn, along with Andrew and Alex from the Isaac Foundation, who've been advocating on behalf of the Finn family to the Premier. Will the Finn family be reimbursed for the life-saving, necessary care for their son, Connor? Yes or no?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We went through this yesterday, and the answer is precisely the same today. My understanding is the Minister of Health had the opportunity to meet with Kirsten. Mr. Speaker, and we appreciate that opportunity. The government appreciates that opportunity. The Minister of Health has committed to looking into this particular case once again, Mr. Speaker, and he is in contact now with the SHA, with the Ministry of Health, as well as other officials. He'll keep Kirsten updated as to when and what ultimately his decision will be. Mr. Speaker, that will be as soon as we are able. Mr. Speaker, it shouldn't take weeks and certainly won't take months.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer should simply be yes.
Hear, hear,
Yesterday, the Premier said we shouldn't talk about these things on the legislature floor. I'm not quite sure what it is that he thinks the legislature is for, Mr. Speaker, as yesterday, in response to questions about the deaths of hundreds of people here in this province, the Premier and his front bench chose to joke, chose to play political games. Today, we know now that over 900 people have lost their lives in Saskatchewan because of COVID-19. Thousands more who loved and now mourn them are suffering. These are not statistics. They're not percentages. They're not numbers. These are real people with real stories, real lives, mothers and fathers, daughters and sons. Does the Premier recognize the disservice he does to the memory of those we've lost when he plays political games instead of taking responsibility for his failures?
Recognize the Premier.
Just to correct the record, Mr. Speaker, my words were, as the Minister of Health will report back to the family. That's precisely what I said yesterday, and I'd appreciate if my words weren't interpreted by the Leader of the Opposition. Those were my words. We can check answer, Mr. Speaker. That is what I said on the floor of this Legislative Assembly. With respect to the global pandemic, Mr. Speaker, it's just that. Is it having an impact in Saskatchewan? Yes. Is it having an impact across Canada? Yes. North America? Yes. Around the world? Most certainly, Mr. Speaker. I don't know that the world has faced a challenge like this since possibly one of the world wars, Mr. Speaker. We most certainly, in this province, have moved this fall with a number of restrictions that, thanks to the effort of Saskatchewan people, are now working. We're nearly 80% down on our 7-day rolling average and our active cases from where we were at the peak, Mr. Speaker, and we're up just under 200,000 vaccinations, Mr. Speaker, due, yes, to a proof of vaccination, proof of negative test policy here in the province. Again, Mr. Speaker, once again, likely not the last time, I say through you to all of the people of this province, thank you for adhering to the public health orders, thank you for adhering to the recommendations that are in place, and thank you for going out and getting vaccinated.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
The Premier's not wrong. It's a global pandemic. It's hit the entire world and this entire country. But in Saskatchewan, we've had the very worst fourth wave, the highest COVID death rate in the entire country, and that is a result of the deliberate decision of this Premier to ignore public health experts. His choices cost hundreds of people their lives. This is not a small thing. On September 4th, Kevin Wasco, physician executive lead with the SHA, said, and I quote, "Saskatchewan is on a barreling freight train to COVID hell, and it's too late to slow down the train even if someone wanted to." That was September 4th, and it appeared the Premier didn't want to. He didn't even try. He didn't do anything else until September 17, and we have experienced exactly that COVID hell that Dr. Wasco predicted. ICUs overwhelmed, hundreds of deaths, and thousands without needed care. Why did the Premier choose to ignore experts like Dr. Wasco? Why did he choose to give Saskatchewan the worst fourth wave in the entire country?
Recognize the Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the preamble to the question is simply incorrect. Mr. Speaker, this government didn't move. We enacted an indoor masking order. We enacted a proof of vaccination, proof of negative test policy, Mr. Speaker. There are public health recommendations that our Chief Medical Health Officer has put in place, Mr. Speaker, around gathering sizes. Mr. Speaker, what we didn't move on was a recommendation by the regional medical health officers that the members opposite did adopt, Mr. Speaker, and it had to do with mandating vaccines in our classrooms. Yeah. And people would...
Like Randy, maybe you want to call for order?
Mr. Speaker, the government, and has confirmed that today, we will not be mandating vaccines for tenants in our schoolrooms across this province, Mr. Speaker. That is the opposition's position, not the government of Saskatchewan's.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That Premier's responses are indecent and disrespectful to the hundreds of people whose lives have been lost because of his choices, Mr. Speaker. He's trying to spin this as good news when we had the highest ICU rates, the highest hospitalization. On October 6th, we had 356 people in our hospitals with COVID-19. Completely overwhelming our healthcare system. The modeling that he saw in June showed that simple masking would have cut the cases in half, cut the hospitalizations in half, and yet he refused to listen. That's 170 people on one day that could have been out in the community instead of risking their lives in the hospital. Does the Premier recognize that his decision to ignore the experts had real life and death consequences?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, once again, no one ignored the recommendations of our Chief Medical Health Officer. Nobody ignored, Mr. Speaker, the conversations that we had with the Chief Medical Health Officer. We acted on those. On September the 16th, Mr. Speaker, we implemented the masking policy, the proof of vaccination, proof of negative test policy. What we did not move on, Mr. Speaker, and a conscious choice of the government, was the recommendation by the regional MHOs to force vaccinations on students in the province. Position of the opposition, not the position of the government.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, to accuse medical health officers of trying to force vaccination on people is completely offensive. Completely offensive. It's offensive to the public health experts that this person ignored. It's offensive.
Order. Leader.
Offensive to those public health experts, and it's offensive to people like Eden Jansen, who is with us today. And I'd ask the members to settle down for a second and pay attention to Eden Jansen. Eden Jansen has been on dialysis for 4 years. She's waiting for surgery. She's waiting for an organ transplant. She heard of the suspension of the transplant program. She heard about it on the radio, Mr. Speaker. She was absolutely devastated. To the Premier, when will the organ transplant program, so needed, be back online?
Recognize the Premier.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I take the opportunity to welcome Eden to her Legislative Assembly here in Saskatchewan, and I inform that there has been impacts, yes, to us reallocating resources in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. Our organ transplant program will be up and running by the end of the month.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Eden receives dialysis 4 times a week. She had dialysis this morning. She was telling me she's exhausted. It's really hard on her. She's not able to live the life of an ordinary 25-year-old. This is an urgent priority. Can the Premier tell us very clearly what is the plan to get the organ transplant program running again? On what day? On what day will we see that program fully running?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, by the end of November, the plan is for the organ transplant program to be up and operating. I would hope all of those that are waiting for organ transplants here in the province would be working closely with their physician to ensure that they will be able to get in for their treatment as soon as possible.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that is many weeks, as months in fact, that this program has not been running. We've heard of at least one more missed opportunity for donation from an organ donor last week. How many total missed opportunities have there been to date, and how many patients have missed their chance to get help because the Premier's choices shuttered this program?
Recognize the Premier.
You have that number? Mr. Speaker, I don't have that number with me here today. We'd endeavour to provide it to the House at the first opportunity. And Mr. Speaker, but what I will say is that our organ donor transplant program will be up and running by the end of the month. That's the target that the SHA, the Ministry of Health, are working to as we speak. Alongside, Mr. Speaker, a number of other programs and services that are offered throughout the Saskatchewan Health Authority and communities right across this province.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Eden isn't simply waiting for a transplant. She's also waiting for a surgery. To be eligible to have her transplant, she needs a parathyroid surgery. She was told that surgery would take 3 to 5 months. That was over a year ago. Now, that surgery is even further delayed because of this Premier's fourth wave healthcare lockdown. Mr. Speaker, what does the Premier have to say to Eden and the thousands who are without care because he chose to ignore the advice of physicians across this province, ignore the advice of Dr. Shahab, and allow us to have the worst fourth wave in the entire country?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of the conversations or the planning or the priority in Eden's particular case and the conversations between her and her physician. What I will say is that surgeries are up and running now, not to 100%, but they're up and ramping up as we speak, as we transition people back into their regular roles, their home roles within the Saskatchewan Health Authority, Mr. Speaker. As we approach the end of the month, our programs and services will be up to return to 90%, offering 90% of those programs and services. We're preserving about 10% of those employees, Mr. Speaker, to run and make available some of our vaccination program, anticipating that the 5 to 11-year-old age group will be available. Mr. Speaker, and as I said a number of times today, and we've said over the course of the last number of days, the transplant program will be up and running by the end of the month.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On October 6th alone, we had 356 people in our hospitals. That's the number of patients in Moose Jaw, Prince Albert, Swift Current, Yorkton combined. Overwhelming our hospital system because of the choices of this Premier. Based on high projections, each of those hospitalizations will average about 15 days and cost around $23,000. So we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. Does the Premier understand that along with preventing the pain and suffering of thousands of Saskatchewan people, he could have saved Saskatchewan tens of millions of dollars if he'd only listened to Dr. Shahab and the experts?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the cost of COVID, not only to Saskatchewan, but to Canadian provinces, and I would put forward to states in the United States and other countries and areas around the world, is great. And is going to go on for, is much larger than the cost of care for those individuals that have been in our hospitals over the course of the past number of months, Mr. Speaker. Again, not in this province or even just in this nation, but around the world. The cost is going to go on for some time. That's why we've been working with the federal government, Mr. Speaker, starting with the Safe Restart plan that we had done with the federal government a number of months ago, which I chaired the Council of Federation through that plan, where there was a little over $20 billion that was transferred to the provinces to address some of the immediate costs that COVID has, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have, as a Council of Federation, put out an ask to the federal government to become a full funding partner in the Canada Health Transfer, to increase that to a full 35% of health care costs. That's a unanimous ask among all 10 provincial premiers and 3 territorial premiers, Mr. Speaker. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, these costs, as we look into the future, are going to be, yes, in ensuring that we increase our surgical capacity, to ensure that folks like Eden and others can get in and get their surgery as quickly as possible, and not just make up the backlog that we have, but ensure that we ultimately have the capacity to keep up with our surgeries as they arrive in the years and decades ahead, Mr. Speaker. There are costs today, yes, Mr. Speaker, not just in Saskatchewan, but across this nation and around the world, and there are costs that are going to be incurred into the future, and we expect the federal government to be a full funding partner in healthcare into the future.
Recognize a member from Regina Rosemont.
900th death here today, yet no acceptance of responsibility from that premier who's failed Saskatchewan people, and the horrible human costs or financial costs. No answer to the question from the Leader of the Opposition, just like there was no answer yesterday with straightforward, direct questions to that Minister of Finance. Inexcusable and preventable human costs and resulting financial costs. So I'll ask the question, or some of those questions again. What is the cost for each Saskatchewan COVID hospitalization?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, to date, as I said yesterday, same answer today, we added an additional $397.7 million into our budget on top of the base health budget for COVID expenditures, and he will see an update on where we're at in just a few weeks.
Here, here, here.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, that's nonsense. The question was asked yesterday. There should have been a straightforward answer. The minister should be prepared here today. No answer there. I'll ask another question that was asked yesterday. What is the cost for each Saskatchewan COVID ICU admission?
Here, here.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has outlined that this is an ongoing cost with the province of Saskatchewan, just like every other province in the country. This is an ongoing cost. It's not a fixed point in time, Mr. Speaker. Right. We have ongoing costs, and as the Premier outlined, Mr. Speaker, we are working with our federal counterparts. We were able to get some of that money up front, and we're going to continue, and we're going to hold them accountable to make sure that they can get their percentage of funding that they originally promised our province. But what I can tell the member opposite is the costs are important, but what we're really focused on is the care that we can provide for those individuals, and it's not always about dollars and cents, Mr. Speaker. It's about caring for those individuals and providing the proper environment for our healthcare workers to be able to do what they do best, and that's take care of the people of Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, for that minister, that failed health minister, to suggest he's going to hold anyone accountable is laughable, Mr. Speaker. The actions of that government have cost Saskatchewan people their lives, and they're costing Saskatchewan's public finances. These are straightforward questions that the finance minister should be able to answer. Another question: what is the cost for flying dozens of patients and their families outside of Saskatchewan for care that they can't be provided here because this government failed them and overwhelmed our health system?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And for a party that slogan is putting people first, they seem to be putting dollars and cents first in front of the people, Mr. Speaker, and it's absolutely shameful. Obviously, we don't have a cost for what is being done in Ontario, and I can't thank our Ontario partners enough for being able to provide that care for that. Mr. Speaker, the reason I can't provide that is because we still have some people in Ontario. We still have just about a dozen people in Ontario that we're working on repatriating as soon as they can get better, Mr. Speaker. But again, Mr. Speaker, it's very ironic that the members over there continue to talk about dollars and cents in one question, and then about people in the other, and then back to dollars and cents. Mr. Speaker, I encourage the member, if she wants to ask a question, maybe she should pop up and ask that question, Mr. Speaker, instead of shouting from her seat again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, obviously we are focused on multiple things. We are focused on the care that the people are providing in our healthcare system. We're also focused on the dollars and cents. But, Mr. Speaker, every time that we have needed more dollars to be able to provide that care, we've been able to step up and provide that. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
What a horrible bunch of spin from that failed health minister. His failures and that government's failure have cost Saskatchewan people their lives. They've cost our healthcare system. They've cost those that need an organ transplant and those that need a surgery and those that are waiting for procedures. And they've cost dollars. They failed Saskatchewan people on many fronts. And we know if that government had chosen to act, they could have reduced ICU admissions by 75%, saving people's lives and saving dollars. They could have reduced infections by 50%. My question is back to the finance minister. How is it not a priority for that minister to own up to the costs that Saskatchewan people are bearing, the inexcusable human costs, and to share with Saskatchewan people the total cost resulting from their mismanagement of COVID?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Rosemont quoted some numbers. I wonder if you can table where he got that from, Mr. Speaker. I'd love to be able to see that information. What I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, is this province would have been in an absolute crisis, Mr. Speaker, if we didn't have the 4,000 additional nurses that we now have in our province since we've had the privilege of forming government. We also have 1,000 more doctors, Mr. Speaker, that are all across this province. Up in the north, we've worked with nurse practitioners. We've expanded scope, Mr. Speaker, and we have invested in our healthcare system. Unlike those members over there who closed 52 hospitals, Mr. Speaker, closed over 1,000 long-term care beds, Mr. Speaker, and that's all they want to do. This is their mantra, Mr. Speaker, to shut things down. They're good at it, Mr. Speaker. They want to shut down the economy. They want to shut down long-term care beds in the past. They want to shut down hospitals, and they want to shut down schools. We're about building this province up, not shutting it down.
Recognize a member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, again, despicable spin from the health minister. And he wants to talk about where those projections come from. That's from his government's modelling. The modelling that government hid. How on earth does he not know that the modelling that was presented to him showed that if they would have acted, they would have reduced ICU admissions by 75%. They would have reduced infections by 50%. They would have saved lives of Saskatchewan people. How on earth does he not know that when it's his modelling?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the
Randy, it's coming from over there.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We did act, Mr. Speaker. In the middle of September, we brought in restrictions, Mr. Speaker. We brought in recommendations, Mr. Speaker. We brought in QR code verification of vaccination and negative tests, Mr. Speaker, and this has been working. As the Premier outlined, almost 200,000 needles have gone into people's arms because of that, Mr. Speaker. We've got Johnson & Johnson coming in. We're working on what we're doing with our 5 to 11-year-olds, Mr. Speaker, our youngest next generation in our province, Mr. Speaker. We're also working on booster shots, Mr. Speaker. But what we did work, and I don't know for the life of me, Mr. Speaker, why they can't understand that our 7-day average is down 77% since we did this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our active cases is around 1,100, another 77% decrease, Mr. Speaker. So how can they continue to stand over there and say that what we're doing isn't working, Mr. Speaker, when it clearly is? This is what's happening here and now, Mr. Speaker. I wish the opposition could get on board with the rest of the people in Saskatchewan and see what good work that the people of Saskatchewan are doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
You know, to the health minister, maybe tell that good news to the one of 900 families that have lost a loved one. Tell that to the thousands of Saskatchewan people that have had their surgeries cancelled. Tell that to folks like Eden, who aren't able to access their organ transplant, or all those that have had their surgeries that have been punted. Mr. Speaker, because of this government's failure to act, we had the highest COVID death rate in the country in October. We also had the worst jobs numbers as a result in October. My question to the Finance Minister, does she even accept that letting COVID run wild, the failure to control it, has been inexcusably damaging to Saskatchewan people's lives and to our public finances?
Recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always edifying to hear from Workers Unite over there. They claim to talk about jobs. But what a tangled web they weave on the economy, Mr. Speaker. The member for Saskatoon-Nutana couldn't bring herself to say the word pipelines, not once, when she was responding to regulations about pipelines, Mr. Speaker. The member for Regina University, as we know, Twitter cheered when Suncor had to lay off 15% of its workforce, Mr. Speaker. And of course, their leader, they talk about jobs. He wouldn't condescend to shake the hands of energy workers. Those are their true colors. And workers know it. They're tired of the contempt. Mr. Speaker, what we do is build on our strengths, complement the sectors we're in, not turn our backs on the 30,000 energy sector workers and their families, Mr. Speaker. For them, there are right jobs, there are wrong jobs, there are right workers, and there are wrong workers. That's where they stand on jobs, Mr. Speaker.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Number one, the Honourable Mr. Wyand.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act 2021, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 57 be now introduced and read a first time. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
Way better than that.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting in the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number two, the Honourable Mr. Wyand.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 58, the Securities Amendment Act 2021, now be introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 58 be now introduced and read a first time. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting.
Item number three, the Honourable Mr. Wyand.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 59, the Justice of the Peace Amendment Act 2021, which is bilingual, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister of Justice that Bill number 59 be now introduced and read a first time. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Next sitting of the Assembly, Mr. Speaker.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day. I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'd seek leave to move a number of motions of condolence.
The Premier has asked leave to make several motions of condolence. Is leave granted? I recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to the province. Eliv Sonny Howard Anderson, who passed away on September the 1st, 2021 at the age of 87. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1975 until 1978 He represented the constituency of Shaunavon for the Liberal Party. Mr. Anderson was born on a farm near Robsart in 1934. He became a farmer and a rancher, serving as a director of the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association and the Saskatchewan Federation of Agriculture, and helping found the Saskatchewan Beef Information Centre. He was also the president of a consulting firm and wrote newspaper articles under the pen name Cypress Sigh. After his time in the legislature, Mr. Anderson served as the executive director of the Saskatchewan Liberal Association. He then moved to Ottawa to work as a special assistant to the federal Minister of Agriculture, which led to his appointment as chairman and chief executive officer of the Farm Credit Corporation from 1982 until 1987. While in Ottawa, Mr. Anderson also attained an Executive Master's of Business Administration degree from Queen's University. He worked in the Prime Minister's office for 6 different Prime Ministers, writing speeches and conducting research on agricultural economics. In addition to being a member of the Maple Creek Masonic Lodge and the Royal Canadian Legion, Mr. Anderson was a lifetime member of Mensa. He was awarded the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal in 1977. Mr. Anderson is survived and sadly missed by his wife of 59 years, Joy, his son Jordan, and family. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family.
Would the House take the motion as read? Carried. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Premier in supporting this motion and offering condolences to the family of Ailiv's Sonny Howard Anderson, to his wife Joy and their son Jordan and family. And it's quite inspiring to read. We'll be talking about many members here who have served in this House, and it's inspiring to read their stories, some of whom were here for long periods, others, like Mr. Anderson, just for a few short years. Their contributions here in this House, joining in this House in the activities of this important Assembly, that's a contribution of great value for each of those members. But it's amazing to read the stories of folks like Mr. Anderson, who went on to have wide and varied careers, his career as a newspaper writer, his career as an advocate within agriculture, his career in Ottawa. This is someone who is the first of 2 members from Shaunavon that we'll be remembering and honoring today. Clearly, Mr. Anderson brought a great deal in his contribution to Saskatchewan and Canada, and I'm pleased to rise and join the Premier in offering condolences to his family and our gratefulness for his service. Thank you.
I recognize a member from Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to join the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition, and also on behalf of the member for Cypress Hills, who now represents the Shaunavon community, in seconding this condolence motion to the family of Mr. Ailiv Sonny Howard Anderson, to his friends, and to the Shaunavon area. Mr. Speaker, I understand that family members have joined in virtually, so thank you to Joy and Jordan today. I'm sure there are many people, Mr. Speaker, not only in that respective community down in southwest Saskatchewan, but also in our province, who have very fond memories of Sonny. Let's start with his nickname. I'm told that sharing the same name and farmyard as his uncles, this caused some confusion from time to time at home. When his mother would call out for Ailiv or Howard, one of his uncles would come running out. So she started using Sonny, and that name stuck from that point on. Asking those who knew Sonny very well, his strong sense of dedication to his community was mentioned often. His humility and respect for others was also apparent. Sonny was well liked and respected by everyone he met. This was clearly evident when all 3 political parties approached him to run for office, a feat I don't think that happens very often these days. Mr. Speaker, when Sonny would speak to you, he listened and spoke to you directly. He treated everyone equally and valued those interactions. Those interactions led to meaningful long-term relationships. Those relationships were valued throughout Sonny's life. He would keep in touch with his old constituents, colleagues, and community members. Afternoon coffees were a common occurrence for Sonny. As Sonny always did those afternoons, he listened and made sure that you as a constituent felt heard. And I want to thank Joy for sharing this last quote. I believe it conveys Sonny's humility and the respect for others that he had so very well. And that quote goes as follows: "As long as the people of this province are served and are happy, that is all the credit that I need." And Mr. Speaker, I am pleased and honored to join the Premier and government in offering my deepest condolences to the Anderson family on the passing of Sonny Howard Anderson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly, with sorrow and regret the passing of former member of this Assembly, and express its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to the province. John Edward Britton, who passed away on October the 16th, 2020, at the age of 96, was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1986 until 1995. He represented the constituency of Wilkie for the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Britton was born in Unity on August the 6th, 1924. He operated a mixed farm in northwestern Saskatchewan alongside his wife, Amy, before purchasing an Imperial Oil bulk franchise in 1956. John worked as the bulk fuel oil dealer with Imperial Oil for 30 years, first in Pierceland and then in Unity, before entering provincial politics in 1986. John was an active member in many community organizations throughout his life. He served as Pierceland's town representative, fire chief, school trustee, and curling club president. In Unity, he sat on the town council for 8 years, chairing various boards and committees. He also held leadership roles in the Masons, the Elks, and the Shriners, including the Masters of the Lodge, exalted ruler, and potentate of his divine. Mr. Britton is survived and sadly missed by his 3 daughters, Barb, Bev, and Cindy, as well as their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join the Premier and all members of this Assembly in supporting the motion of condolences for Mr. John Britton. Mr. Britton, whose constituency would have covered some of the same territory as yourself, Mr. Speaker, representing Wilkie, is a farmer, a bulk fuel dealer, a community leader, and a representative of his constituents. I want to thank him for his service and ask all members to join in passing on the condolences to his daughters, Barb, Bev, Cindy and their families, and all those who knew Mr. Britton and were grateful for his service. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Cut Knife Turtleford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's an honour for me to rise this afternoon and say a few words about John Britton. John was the Progressive Conservative MLA for Wilkie from 1986 to 1995. He served 2 terms representing the Wilkie constituency, serving his respective constituents. John was the 4th of a large family of 13 and was born and received his schooling in Unity. John's experience as a business owner and being a part of various committees and boards undoubtedly offered him valuable tools and insights as he entered into provincial politics. John's interest in provincial politics peaked after a federal election, after hearing a budget speech by the former Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. This enticed him into becoming more involved in provincial politics and eventually running in his hometown constituency. During John's time as an MLA, his passions included the important constituent top 3 issues, which included agriculture, oil, and industrial diversification. John represented all constituents of his constituency, not just those that supported him, and he was very honored to do so. In his grandson's words, John was very faithful in his commute to Regina. During his 2 terms as an MLA, John did in fact wear out a few vehicles in that time. John was an advocate for seniors' health, the seniors' income plan, and building of long-term care homes. He was proud of the legacy left by his government. John had budget sense, as he knew you shouldn't make promises you can't afford. John offered a practical, just make sense approach to his provincial political role. In 1997, after he served his constituency as an MLA, John also petitioned to support the establishment of the now current governing Saskatchewan party. John was fortunate to live to the age of 96. During this time, he had seen the progression of the province of Saskatchewan from, as his grandson put it, the horse and buggy days to the modern-day society we have today. John's grandson, Chad Bast, also let me know that his grandfather, John, was sharp as a tack right up until his passing of October last year. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize and send my condolences to John and Amy's 3 daughters, Barbara, Beverly, and Cindy, along with their families. I would also like to extend a special thank you to Chad Bast, the grandson of John that spoke with me and offered me some personal stories that I was able to incorporate into my motion today. Thank you.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution he made to his community, to his constituency, and to the province. John Edward Brocklebank, who passed away on February the 3rd, 2020, at the age of 88 years. He was a member of the Legislative Assembly from 1964 until 1982, and then again from 1986 until 1991. Representing the constituencies of Saskatoon City for the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and the Saskatoon Mayfair constituency and Saskatoon Westmount constituency for the New Democratic Party. Mr. Brocklebank served on Executive Council as the Minister of Public Works, Minister of Government Services, the Minister of Telephones. He also served as Speaker of the Legislative Assembly from 1975 until 1982. Mr. Brocklebank was born in Tisdale on February 23, 1931, and he spent his early childhood years in the Bjorkdale district until 1944, when his father, John Hegwell Brocklebank, was appointed to Cabinet, and then the family moved to Regina. Mr. Brocklebank completed his education in Regina, including 1 year at the University of Saskatchewan at the Regina campus. In 1951, Mr. Brocklebank accepted a position as an instrument technician in Saskatoon. He became very active in the labour and cooperative movement, serving in various posts in the locale of the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers International Union, as well as on the board of the Saskatoon Co-op Association and the Saskatoon Low Rental Housing Authority. From 1982 until 1986, Mr. Brocklebank served as a Saskatoon alderman until his ultimate re-election to this House. Mr. Brocklebank is survived and sadly missed by his wife Ina and their children, Greg and Doug, alongside their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to members of the bereaved family.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I'm honored to rise and join with the Premier in recognizing and passing condolences for the passing of John Brocklebank. John was, of course, the second John Brocklebank to serve in this legislature, following in the footsteps of his father, both elected as CCF members and later Mr. Brocklebank, the second of the two, as an NDP member. He served in a number of key ministry roles and also sat in the chair you're sitting in, Mr. Speaker, which is obviously an extremely important contribution. After his time in the legislature, Mr. Brocklebank remained very active in the party. We would frequently see him at party events. I believe the last time I had a chance to have a chat with him was at the 90th birthday party of Anne Blakeney, where John and I had a chance to talk about his time in service and as well the issues of the day, of which he was very much aware and interested, and had I recall a very fine conversation with his wife Ina at that time as well. I am saddened by his loss and honored to be able to rise today, pass on condolences to Ina, their children Greg, Doug, and families, and join the Premier in passing this motion of condolences.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to participate in debate around this condolence motion for John Edward Brocklebank, who represented the CCF and NDP from 1964 through 1982 and 86 through 91. His father, John H. Brocklebank, served as a cabinet minister under Tommy Douglas. He ran against Tommy for the leadership, in fact. As Leslie Newman wrote, John grew up in a world where service and politics were part of the fabric of life. John joined Air Cadets as a teenager, that's something we have in common, and got his pilot's license, that's something we do not have in common. When he decided to get involved in politics, John lost his first nomination by 5 votes. I think many of us have encountered challenges throughout our political careers, especially at the beginning, and know that it takes a certain strength of character to get back on the horse. But that's exactly what John did. I had a look through John's maiden speech in this Assembly. The province had just experienced 20 years of CCF governments under Tommy Douglas and Woodrow Lloyd, and Ross Thatcher's Liberals were in power. John didn't give them an inch, intensely focused on economy, jobs, training, and innovation, particularly the impact on his own riding. He spoke passionately about the government's deletion of the Women's Bureau and recited a satirical poem about free enterprise that included the passage, "How blind the socialists to plot, this way of life to shatter. Free enterprise brings wealth to all, at least to all who matter." During his 24 years of elected life, he served as a minister and as Speaker. He presided over a tumultuous time as Speaker after 11 years as an MLA and was widely praised by both sides of the Assembly for his fair treatment and rulings. In June 1998, he led a filibuster late into the night that he turned into a telethon, encouraging those watching from home to call in at 1 a.m., reading their messages live in the Assembly as they were passed along to him. The Star Phoenix said that the NDP gave new meaning to the term participatory democracy that early Wednesday morning. John was a defender of the importance of the role we hold as elected officials and was ashamed of the behavior of members in the chamber when school kids were visiting. I think we can still relate to this. He also served as a Saskatoon City Councillor for Ward 4 and served on several boards, including Saskatoon Co-op, Saskatoon Low Rental Housing Authority, and the Meewasin Valley Authority. After his retirement, he remained engaged and wrote letters to the editor on pollution in Lake Diefenbaker, the Senate scandal, the government's shortcomings on healthcare, education, and questionable financial dealings, and in 2001, where he wrote of Highway 15's broken pavement, and I quote, "You could say the highway problem is wall to wall," and of course, wall was capitalized, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to strongly support this motion of condolence, Mr. Speaker, give my thoughts to the family, and to thank John Edward Brocklebank for his service to our province.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt? Oh, sorry. I recognize the member from Regina will respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to weigh in, albeit briefly, to recognize someone who's made his province a better place throughout his life, John Edward Brocklebank, and to extend certainly condolences and love to Ina Brocklebank and the whole family. John, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more genuine, caring individual, His life was one of service, both in local community organizations, as you'll see in his biography, but also to his province and through this Assembly, holding honourable posts and serving incredibly well as minister and as speaker, long-serving speaker with the Ellen Blakeney government. Any time that you had with Mr. Brocklebank, it was clear how much he loved this province and how much he believed that the service of those inside this Assembly was to better the lives of Saskatchewan people and strengthen that province, and how much as well he loved his party and how important he felt it to be that we do all we can to ensure that it's as strong as it can be. He was active in his community and in his party throughout his entire life. From a personal perspective, as someone who served for a little bit and began service at a young age, I really benefited from the care of a party elder like John Brocklebank. His calls, his conversations, his notes of care, and bit of advice were really appreciated throughout my life of service. He was able to draw on roots within this province and a party that few others could, with the fact that his dad, of course, had served many years in this Assembly, had served, in fact, as the leader of the opposition when George Hara Williams had resigned his seat to go serve in the Second World War, served as an honourable minister in the governments of Tommy Douglas. So it's hard to find individuals like John Edward Brocklebank that can weave together the history of this province and the pride in service that he could. So I'm thankful for all the conversation and advice and time over the years. He was also an avid outdoors person who loved his time at their cabin at Diefenbaker. Again, without doubt, the life of John Edward Brocklebank made a difference in so many lives and made his province a better place. And it's with deep appreciation that we provide these remarks and offer sincere condolences to Ina and the entire family.
The pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and express its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to this province. Neil Erland Byers, who passed away on July the 3rd, 2020, at the age of 91. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1969 until 1982, representing the constituencies of Kelvington and Kelvington-Wadena for the New Democratic Party. Mr. Byers served on Executive Council as the Minister of Highways and Transportation, Minister of Cooperation and Cooperative Development, Minister of the Environment, Minister of Telephones, and the Minister of Northern Saskatchewan. Mr. Byers was born in Fertile on December the 7th, 1928. Upon completion of high school, he taught in rural schools near Frobisher and Estevan before attending normal school in Moose Jaw. In 1961, he received his Bachelor of Education from the University of Saskatchewan, and he then moved his family to Foam Lake, where he taught high school. After his political career, Mr. Byers had a commercial potato farm. He was a hail adjuster, and he taught adult basic education. He enjoyed curling and playing music with the Regina Heritage Fiddlers, as well as with his band, which was called Country Swing. Mr. Byers is survived and sadly missed by his children, Wayne, Val, Eleanor, Sandra, Roland, and Candace, alongside their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to members of the bereaved family.
Will the House take the motion as read? I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to rise and join the Premier in supporting this motion of condolence on the passing of Neil Byers. And Neil Byers, who served as a New Democratic MLA from 1969 until 1982, representing Kelvington and Kelvington-Wadena. Mr. Byers had a career as a teacher before being elected and taught again in adult basic education afterwards. He remained throughout his life keenly interested in Saskatchewan politics, and that interest passed on to his family as well. His son Wayne ran for us for the NDP on 2 occasions, in 2003 and 2016. The Byers family has great roots in our province and great roots in the New Democratic Party. We're grateful to have had the chance to know Neil and to have had his service in his role as minister, capable minister in highways, in cooperative development, in environment, as minister for Northern Saskatchewan, as minister for telephones. He represented the people of Kelvington and Wadena area well. He served the people of Saskatchewan well, and it's an honor to join in adding our condolences to this House, to the people of Saskatchewan, and to his family.
I recognize the member from Kelvington-Wadena.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my honor to rise today and speak to this motion of condolence. I unfortunately didn't know Mr. Byers, and I wish I would have. I find his history very interesting, and in particular, growing up in a small community and the life that he would have led through those times. I'm particularly interested because he would have been a minister of the government during some very tumultuous times, both internationally and some of the things that were happening provincially. Internationally, if you recall, in those early years, it was the Vietnam War, and which created a lot of stress and tension in global politics, and I'm sure it would have had some impact on even the province of Saskatchewan at the time. But also, during his time was the creation of some of the early crowns. I'm thinking particularly of Sask Oil, Sask Minerals, and they later evolved into some other global industries, but it would have been very interesting to participate in those discussions back in that time. I want to particularly note that it's noted in the motion that he taught at a school outside of Frobisher. So I can only assume that that was probably a one-room country school, to which I look back fondly. I'm one of the very few probably in this legislature that actually attended a one-room country school. So I can tell you that that would have been a very interesting experience to have chatted with him about as well. And later in life, he did the Saskatchewan things. He was a curler, and I'm also particularly interested that he played in a country band called Country Swing, and I think that that's just absolutely fantastic. He did teach again in my constituency in Foam Lake, and so on behalf of the constituents of Kelvington-Wadena, we do want to extend our condolences to the family and certainly support the motion of condolence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise and join with the members, including the Premier and the Leader of Opposition, in this condolence for Mr. Neil Byers and his family. I only met Neil a few times during the sunset of his life, so I don't know him well, but I feel like I know him well because I know his daughter, Val, quite well. She has been a dedicated volunteer with the NDP for decades, Mr. Speaker, and a resident of Regina Douglas Park for nearly that entire length of time, and has served as a friend and a confidant and my constituency secretary for quite a while, Mr. Speaker. And so through her and her stories and her deep love for her father, I feel like I've had the opportunity to get to know Neil and to get to learn a bit about what it's been like living with him all this time, Mr. Speaker. And through that family, they gifted me with some stories and some information that I'd like to share today. Neil was born December 7th, 1928 at Fertile, Saskatchewan. He was raised at Frobisher, Saskatchewan, the eldest of 5 siblings. He taught in one-room country schools near Frobisher and south of Estevan before attending normal school in Moose Jaw. In the fall of 1952, he began teaching in the newly opened Jubilee Day School. In November 1952, Neil and Margaret Ankel were married. Later, the family moved to Percival and then to Alameda. In 1961, Neil graduated from the University of Saskatchewan with a Bachelor of Education. Neil taught high school in Foam Lake when he was elected to the legislature as the MLA for Kelvington in June of 1969. From what I've heard, was a fairly controverted by-election, Mr. Speaker. He was actually, because he was elected during a by-election at that time, he has the honor of being the very first MLA elected as a New Democrat in Saskatchewan, something that I know the family is very proud of. He was re-elected in 1971, 1975, and 1978, and served until April of 1982. In June of 1971, Neil was appointed Minister of Highways in the newly elected Blakeney government. In May of 1972, he was appointed what became the very first Minister of Environment for Saskatchewan. Another point of pride, Mr. Speaker. He also served as Minister for Northern Saskatchewan with additional responsibilities for telephones, cooperatives, Saskatchewan Transportation Company, and the Saskatchewan Liquor Board. He proudly served the people of Saskatchewan for 13 years. He also was very much a constituency MLA, and one year he attended 17 fall suppers. Following politics, Neil had a commercial potato farm on the family farm at Frobisher. He also was a hail adjuster and taught adult basic education in locations throughout the province. Neil had a lifelong passion for music. He played the fiddle whenever he had the opportunity. He played with the Regina Heritage Fiddlers and his band, Country Swing. They entertained in many venues in southern Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, sadly, Neil was predeceased by his wife, Margaret, in 2016. However, he is survived by his 6 children, 4 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, along with his sister, Donna Baldwin. And it's to those individuals that I thank, including with Neil, for his service, their service to this province. I do, before I conclude my remarks, want to quote a particular segment of Neil's maiden speech that he made in February 23rd, 1970, that rang resonant with me. And he said on that day, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I realize that the privilege to serve the people of Saskatchewan in this legislature is one granted to very few people. It is my intention as a member to carry out the responsibilities that accompany that privilege to you, to this House, to my constituents, and to the people of Saskatchewan." Thank you.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Theodore, or Ted, Robert Gleim, who passed away on May the 13th, 2019, at the age of 85. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1986 until 1991. He represented the constituency of Shaunavon for the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Gleim was born in 1933. He worked as a labourer before joining SaskTel, where he worked for 11 years. He and his wife, May Bastard, were married in 1961. In 1965, they had the opportunity to farm the Lee Bastard land in East End, which they continued to do for the next 34 years. Ted was involved in many clubs and organizations in East End, including the Redcoat Trail Association, the K40 Club, the RM of White Valley Council, and the District Agricultural Board. He served as president of the Kinsman Club and the Chamber of Commerce, as chair of the East End Rink Complex Board, and served as the mayor of East End from 1982 until 1986. Mr. Gleim has survived, and he is sadly missed by his wife of 57 years, May, as well as their children, Laurel, Stacy, and alongside their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathies to the members of the bereaved family.
Members take the motion as read. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join the Premier in expressing condolences and supporting this motion in memory of Mr. Ted Gleim. Ted is the second member representing Shaunavon that we honour today. Mr. Gleim was the member from 1986 until 1991. He worked for SaskTel and later farmed for over 30 years. He was a community leader in the town of East End and involved in many clubs in that community. I have family in East End. When we were growing up, used to spend some time there. I'm going to have to reach out and ask about their memories of Mr. Gleim. He is survived and missed by his wife, May, and their children, Laurel and Stacy. I'd like to join the members of this Assembly in passing on our condolences to the family.
Recognize the member from Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to add a few words to the motion of condolence on behalf of the member for Cypress Hills and to second the motion of the Premier on Theodore Ted Robert Gleim. I understand that his wife, May, and family have joined us virtually today, so thank you to them for tuning in. For those who knew Ted, community involvement was at the forefront of his life. We heard a little bit about that earlier here today. This was seen through his numerous community engagements with clubs, organizations, and groups, such as the K40 Club, the East End Rink Complex Board, and so many more countless organizations. It's no surprise that Ted would continue on and represent his community as the mayor of East End from 1982 until 1986, and then, as we've heard earlier, serving as well as the member for the Legislative Assembly representing the constituency of Shaunavon from 1986 up until 1991. After his political career, things didn't change too much for Ted. He could be seen volunteering for community projects, was always willing to lend a helping hand to friends and family and neighbors, literally to anyone who asked. Ted's favorite activities often involved anything that had to do with his family, grandchildren, friends, or as he referred to it as, hanging with the gang. Ted knew where his priorities were. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity on a couple of very brief occasions to meet Ted many years ago, early on in my political career, and I can just honestly say that Ted was the type of individual whose personality and whose smile would light up a room, and he just immediately was an engaging individual, and that was so obvious upon the moment that you would meet Ted for the very first time. And Mr. Speaker, I am pleased and honored to join the Premier, the government, in offering my deepest condolences to the Gleim family on the passing of Theodore Ted Robert Gleim. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Dennis Marvin Ham, who passed away on January the 12th, 2019 at the age of 77. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1975 until 1982. He represented the constituency of Swift Current, firstly for the Progressive Conservative Party. He later sat as an independent member and as the founding member of the Unionist Party, pardon me. Mr. Ham was born in Swift Current in 1941, and at a young age he joined his family's car dealership, Ham Motors, and he became a partner, eventually managing the service department. Mr. Ham served as president and executive director for the Swift Current United Appeal, director of the Swift Current Agricultural and Exhibition Association, and director of the Saskatchewan Motor Club. He was also a Shriner for many years, leading the Swift Current Shriners Band as the drum major. Following his political career, Mr. Ham moved to Calgary, where he began a very successful career in insurance. Later in life, he became an active worshiper at the Centre Street Church in Calgary, where he volunteered as a greeter on Sundays. Mr. Ham is survived and is sadly missed by his children, Darren and Tricia, alongside their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family. I so move.
Would the Assembly take the motion as read? I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join the Premier in honoring the member for Swift Current from 75 until 1982, Mr. Dennis Ham. Now, we know that he was a member of the Progressive Conservative Party, later an independent, and then founding member of the Unionist Party. That must have made for some interesting days and some headlines at that time. We see that Mr. Ham clearly had a very successful career, both in Ham Motors and later as an insurance, in insurance in Calgary. We thank him for his service and join the members here in passing on condolences to Darren and Tricia, his children, and their families. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Swift Current.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity today to say a few words of condolence on the passing of Dennis Marvin Ham, who served for the constituency of Swift Current as the MLA. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tell a bit of a story here, an anecdote from a former constituent that speaks to Mr. Ham and the type of individual that he was. This former constituent of mine, Mr. Speaker, many years ago was a first-year university student and was doing a paper on political science. And he had recognized Mr. Ham's name from Law and Science, of course, around town during the elections, and also this student's parents knew Mr. Ham a little bit. This particular university student was doing a paper on party discipline and felt that Mr. Ham would be an excellent subject to interview on that particular topic. So he had his parents reach out to Mr. Ham, who at this point was out of politics, actually living in Calgary. And it's my understanding that Mr. Ham took the opportunity, took the time to phone this young university student back and do a very thorough and lengthy interview and describe his experience in politics and really was very gracious to that university student in helping him out. And the university student said that, to his credit, he took this time to answer all of his questions, so many questions, and to help him with his paper. And he felt that that was it spoke highly of Mr. Ham, that he would actually go out and do this to a former constituent of his, someone that he barely knew, to take time to do an interview for him on this university paper. By the way, the university student says that he did okay with the paper, but he was left with that experience being so grateful for Mr. Ham's generosity. And that speaks to the type of individual that he was. He was known as a hard-working and a responsive MLA, and folks in this assembly might know that politics runs deep in that family, as Mr. Ham's younger sister is Linda Haberstock, and she, of course, would get involved in politics as well. Mr. Speaker, I'd wrap up that story by saying that that particular university student who had left that Mr. Ham had left a very strong impression on from doing that helping out with that university paper, would later decide to get involved in politics, would actually serve as the MLA for Swift Current from 1999 until 2018 and become the 14th Premier of Saskatchewan, Mr. Brad Wall. Mr. Speaker, I am honored to join the Premier and government in offering my deepest condolences to the Ham family and express our condolences to friends and family on the passing of Dennis Marvin Ham. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is it the pleasure of Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. John Paul Meagher, who passed away on May the 28th, 2019. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1982 until 1986. He represented the constituency of Prince Albert for the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Meagher was born in Prince Albert in 1939. He grew up in a log cabin in Christopher Lake, as well as throughout North America, due to his father's various jobs and businesses with American relatives. Mr. Meagher was a journeyman plumber and was the owner and operator of the Northern Plumbing and Heating for over 40 years. In 1964, he married Barbara, and they had 3 daughters, Colleen, Donna, and Sharon. In his later years, he and his second wife, Judy, spent their time traveling, cruising, and RVing. Mr. Meagher is survived and is sadly missed by his wife, Judy, and his daughters, Donna and Sharon, and their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family. I so move.
Will the House take the motion as read? I recognize the leader of the carried. I recognize the leader of the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join the Premier and all the members present in honoring the memory of Mr. John Meagher, honoring his service in this House from 1982 until 1986, as well as his service in the community of Prince Albert, where he was born and raised, and ran the Northern Plumbing and Heating business for over 40 years. We're grateful to him for his service and pass on our condolences to his wife, Judy, and his daughters, Donna and Sharon, and their families. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Prince Albert North Cope.
It is an honour to rise today and speak to this motion of condolence in memory of John Paul Meagher, the Progressive Conservative MLA for Prince Albert from 1982 to 1986, and to offer my sincere condolences to his family. As was said, John Paul was born in Prince Albert and raised on the farm near Christopher Lake, but his father's business took him to various parts of the United States, and he was able to spend time with other family there. And as a young man, he earned his journeyman license as a plumber and went on to own and operate his own business, Northern Plumbing and Heating. And it was very well known and a very successful business in Prince Albert area for over 40 years. And I do remember hearing about Northern Plumbing and Heating. I didn't know John Paul Meagher personally, so I'm only sharing a bit of what I've been able to learn about him. I understand he always had a keen interest in politics, and he enjoyed discussing the political news of the day over breakfast or a cup of coffee at a local cafe with his friends. This was evident as he ran in both the 1975 and 1978 provincial elections before he was elected in 1982. Outside politics, Jean Paul was a proud member of AA for over 47 years, where he was a devoted sponsor to many and supported many people at many times of the day. He enjoyed the AA roundups, where he made many longtime friends. John Paul Meagher considered the greatest gifts in his life to be the many people in it. He had a great love of family and enjoyed spending time with them, and especially with his grandchildren at the lake. He enjoyed traveling throughout his life, and in his later years also spent time in Florida. It is an honor to stand here today and join the Premier and offer my deepest condolences to the family of John Paul Meagher.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Gerald Stanley Muirhead, who passed away on May the 23rd, 2020 at the age of 89. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1978 until 1995, representing the constituency of Arm River for the Progressive Conservative Party, and he served on Executive Council from 1983 until 1985. Mr. Muirhead was born in Davidson on April the 8th, 1931, and was raised on a farm west of Craik. After completing primary and secondary school, he studied agriculture and he became a farmer. Prior to his election in the Legislative Assembly, he also worked as a councillor for the rural municipality of Craik. Gerald was involved in many clubs and organizations in his community. He served as the president of the Craik Lions Club. He was a leader in his local 4-H program, and he was a lifetime member of the Craik Agricultural Society. As a livestock producer, he was the Saskatchewan representative of the Canadian Romagnola Association and an active member of the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool. He was heavily involved in church activities, sitting on the board of the Associated Gospel Church and serving as an elder. Mr. Muirhead is survived and sadly missed by his wife of 66 years, Helen, and their sons, Ken, Dennis, alongside their families. Mr. Speaker, I'd move that in recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, that this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to members of the bereaved family.
Will the members take the motion as read? Carried. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to join the Premier and the members assembled today to pass condolences on the passing of Gerald Muirhead. Gerald passed away at the age of 89. He had a long service in this House from 1978 until 1995, including a term in Executive Council from 83 until 85. Mr. Muirhead was a farmer, a livestock producer, active in his local church, and a community leader. He's survived by his wife of 66 years, Helen, their sons, Ken and Dennis, and their families. And we rise today to pass on our condolences to the family and honor the memory of Mr. Muirhead. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Arm River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise today to recognize and pay my respects to an Arm River predecessor of mine, Gerald Stanley Muirhead. Mr. Speaker, while I never had the distinct privilege of formally meeting Mr. Muirhead, I did come to know him quite well in the recent years through the eyes and memories of those who knew him. As both a candidate well on the campaign trail and as an MLA out and about in the constituency of Arm River, time and time again, people would eagerly share personal stories of their connections with Mr. Muirhead. The theme of these stories was always the same, Mr. Speaker, that being Mr. Muirhead was a straightforward man who subscribed to the school of hard work, perseverance, and dedication. And, Mr. Speaker, it would be more than fair to say that Mr. Muirhead worked to earn the support of his constituents. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, I had the good fortune to speak with Mr. Muirhead's granddaughter, Nicole Radfeller, and I did have the pleasure of working with her and calling her my colleague a number of years ago. She shared that in addition to his big heart and love of family, Grandpa Muirhead had a passion for politics that he instilled in his grandchildren from a young age. Nicole vividly recalls her involvement in past election campaigns, learning the importance of politics firsthand from Grandpa. She also remembers the MLA phone Grandpa had, the phone that rarely left his side, and the one that he always answered when it rang. Mr. Speaker, Gerald Muirhead lived with a passion to serve his constituents. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude for Mr. Muirhead's years of service, a service that spanned from 1978 to 1995, and offer my deepest sympathies to his wife, Helen, and the entire Muirhead family on their loss.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly, with sorrow and regret, the passing of a former member, that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly, and we express our grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Metro Carl Ribchuk, who passed away on October the 15th, 2021 at the age of 85. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1982 until 1986, representing the constituency of Regina, Victoria for the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Ribchuk was born in Swan Plain on December the 16th, 1935. After completing high school, he moved to Regina and began working at Regina Motor Products, first in the truck lot, and then as a car salesman. Following his marriage to Eileen Klink in 1958, Mr. Ribchuk worked at a meatpacking plant and as an insurance salesman before being elected to the legislature in 1982. Mr. Ribchuk has been very involved with St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church, where he served in many positions throughout his life, including as chairman of the building's parish hall. In 1986, he took over the catering and caretaking and management of the hall and established Ribchuk's Catering Company, a business that remains in the family today. Mr. Ribchuk is survived, and he is sadly missed by his wife of 63 years, Eileen, and their children, Lori, Robert, Karen, Brian, Donna, James, Michael, Jason, and their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family. I so move.
Will the members take the motion as read? Carried. I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise and join with the Premier, both as the Deputy Leader and the current MLA for Regina Douglas Park, to join in these condolence motions for Mitro and his family. Mr. Speaker, the constituency of Regina Victoria is now, as I said, mostly the constituency of Regina Douglas Park, some of which is now also the constituency for Regina Elphinstone Centre. And I had the opportunity to speak with some members of Mitro's family, and I want to thank them for their generosity of their time and their willingness to share stories with me of Mitro and his life. Mr. Speaker, during his 4 years of service in this legislature, he left a very lasting memory on his colleagues of whom ended up being his lifelong friends, Mr. Speaker. And in speaking with the family, they mentioned that there was one thing in particular that was very important to Mitro in his service in this building, and that was the cooperation and collaboration between parties. And he's very proud of the work that he could do in reaching out to the other side of the aisle, in ensuring that things that would benefit this province would get done through that work. And in fact, his family informed me that when he was elected first as MLA, it was in fact his friends on the other side of the aisle, his NDP friends, who reached out to him and showed him the ropes, in particular Bob Mitchell and Ed Trzowski. And in fact, he lived once with the Mitchell family, Mr. Speaker. He said that they were able to cooperate over the years on many different files, and some of the achievements that he was very proud of, in particular the nitrogen fertilizer plant with Cargill at Belle Plaine, which eventually became Sask-Furco and is now Yarra. This was an originally small government investment that became one of the largest transactions in Saskatchewan's history, netting the province almost $1 billion in revenues, as well as many jobs that are still in Regina to this day. In addition, he's quite proud of being able to sell some investments that were not profitable at that time, including the government's mortgage on the Cornwall Shopping Centre in Regina and its shares in Intercontinental Packers in Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to read some of Mitro's speeches, including his inaugural speech And I will say he was no shrinking violet politically. His speeches were fiery, they were very entertaining, and they were wonderful to read. I won't repeat any of them here, Mr. Speaker, because I don't want to give members opposite any good ideas for tomorrow's question period, but please know that I enjoyed them. And what I enjoyed the most about them is, even though they were quite fiery and sharp at members opposite, you could tell, based on talking to the family, that as soon as question period was over, as soon as those adjourned debates were over, he was quick to go to the other side of the aisle to reach out to his friends on the other side. He understood the importance of the work that's done here, but as well as the work that's done in terms of human interaction across party lines. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us to take with us moving forward, Mr. Speaker. Mitro's life and history will be lived on through his loving wife, Eileen, his children, his many children, and his many, many grandchildren, Mr. Speaker, but will also be lived on through Ribchuck's Catering, which he started and has now been passed on to his son, Mike. It's been continued to run as a family business to this day, Mr. Speaker. They make, from what I understand, some of the best dessert in the city. So I encourage all members to think about Mitro. Consider ordering from Ribchuck's Catering next time you perhaps have some sort of a gathering, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Mitro, but not just Mitro, his wife, Eileen, all of his children, for their service to this legislature, because as we all know, it takes the sacrifice of a family for all of us to be here to do this work. So I want to thank them for that, and along with the Premier, extend my most sincere condolences for their loss of their husband, father, and grandfather.
Recognize a member from Regina Rochdale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to enter into the debate or the motion of condolence. Metro Ribchuck, he may have not been a very tall man, but he had the biggest heart. Maybe because I had the opportunity to meet Metro and his family over 20 years ago, working on a political campaign, and he was a proud conservative. And we worked hard together for, you know, when you're working on a political campaign, you're kind of living together 24 hours a day for 30 days, and you get to know each other really well. I got to know his family really well, and you realized he was a dedicated family man. So he was so proud of his children. He was proud of the work that each and every one of them did. And he was also very proud of his grandchildren. So I just felt so honored to be able to know Metro as a good conservative friend, but also as a personal friend. And maybe because we both share a birthday of December 16th, we kind of had a little thing going. But he absolutely, he just was so, a very dedicated family man, and to his church and his community. And I think the city of Regina is going to be the poorer for it, for the loss of Metro, because he was a larger-than-life figure who absolutely just touched each and every person he came in contact with. He was always so welcoming, and just, you know, the big hug and the big voice. He reminded me so much of my dad, Emil, with that short man, but with a big, tall heart. And so I'm so pleased to have so many of his children and grandchildren sitting in your speaker's gallery today, able to join us for this motion of condolence to a very special friend, Metro Ribchuck. Thank you very much.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly, and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, to his province. Lloyd David Sauter, who passed away on July 19th, 2021, at the age of 71. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1982 until 1991. He represented the constituency of Nipawin for the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Sauter was born in Carrot River on April the 8th, 1950, and he grew up on the family farm. After completing high school, his work in mining, in oil, and power line construction took him across Western Canada and the United States, as well as the Arctic, before he returned to the Carrot River area to pursue farming. In addition to farming, Mr. Sauter also tried his hand at logging, at custom spraying, and at running a wood pellet plant. In later years, Mr. Sauter assisted his family with the operation of the farm and spent a few winters clearing roads in northern Alberta. He enjoyed traveling, reading, gardening, and cooking, as well as the arts of blacksmithing and knife making. Mr. Sauter is survived and sadly missed by his wife, Connie, and his children, Leora, Oakley, Leaf, Will, and Ira, alongside their families. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family. I so move.
Will the members take the motion as read? Carried. I recognize the member from Regina, Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise and enter and join with the Premier as Deputy Leader in the condolence motion for Mr. Lloyd David Sauter, who served in this Assembly for 9 years as a member of the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Speaker, his work that he did prior to his political life took him essentially all over North America, Mr. Speaker, and I think in that work it led him to the service and to the wide range of experience that allowed him to do the work that he was able to do here in this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank his wife, Connie, and his children, Leora, Oakley, Leaf, Will, and Ira, for their sacrifice and their service to their province. And I would like to join with the Premier in expressing my most sincere condolence to the family for the loss of Mr. Sauter.
Recognize the member from Carrot River Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise today to speak in the memory of Lloyd Sauter. I'm glad that his son Leaf is here in the West Gallery also. I've known Lloyd basically pretty well all my life. I'm from Carrot River. Lloyd was born in Carrot River, so I've known him. I knew Lloyd for a long time. And, you know, Lloyd tried his hand at a lot of different things, and he did well at all of them. Of course, in 1982, when he was elected to the legislature with the Nipawin constituency, he was pretty young and had a young family at that time. And let's face it, we all know in here how much time this takes, especially when you live a long ways away from home. And him having a young family, it had to be awfully tough. And I remember it was just a matter of a couple of years ago, I was talking to Lloyd, and he says, "So, what do you think of that drive to Regina?" And I said, well, it gets a little old sometimes, but, you know, the highways are improving. I thought I'd throw that in. But he said, yeah, he said, I remember the last day that I went down there, I was so happy to be done. And I can see that when you're sitting there with a young family. But, you know, he was very helpful. I can still remember he had a young family, and I actually was on the beginning of the NESIP board, the Northeastern Early Childhood Intervention Program, and it was in Tisdale. And we were just getting started. We were having some problems. And so I asked Lloyd to come over and attend one of our board meetings, and even though he was going to get home late at night, absolutely no problem. That was the kind of a person that Lloyd was. Unfortunately, Lloyd's first wife, Cheryl, passed away in 2011, far too young. And, but Lloyd continued on, and he remarried Connie Schill in 2017. Lloyd was well known for his cooking skills around. He could make just about anything, but was famous for his raisin pies. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with cancer in 2020, and he beat that first round of it, but in 21 it came back and got him again, and unfortunately he didn't win that one. Lloyd was a great person, very likable. He worked hard for his constituents, and he's survived by his wife Connie, daughter Leora, I should say, sons Oakley, Leaf, Will, and Ira, and 12 grandchildren. So, Mr. Speaker, he will be missed, and I am pleased to offer my condolences to the Lloyd Sauter family, and I support the motion of the Premier. Thank you.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This next individual will move a motion for is a larger-than-life figure, Mr. Speaker, to the point that I think his impact on the province, on agriculture, on Western Canada has gone far beyond the walls of this Assembly, the floor of this Assembly, Mr. Speaker, and I will honour to his family him in just a moment, but we should recognize the impact that Mr. Percy Schmeiser has had on really Western Canada and all of Canada, to the point where they've made a movie about a number of his points of involvement in agriculture here just recently. Mr. Speaker, I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Percy Arnold Schmeiser, who passed away on October the 13th, 2020 at the age of 89 years. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1967 until 1971, representing the constituency of Watrous for the Liberal Party. Mr. Schmeiser was born in Bruno on January the 5th, 1931. After completing his education in Bruno, he attended Radio College in Toronto, obtaining a diploma in radio and TV technology, and he returned to the family business in 1954. Mr. Schmeiser was very active in his community. He was elected as a town councillor in 1962, as mayor in 1967, while he was also serving as MLA. He served on council for over 25 years. Mr. Schmeiser was also involved in many local organizations, including the Lions Club, the Knights of Columbus, the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, the Bruno Savings and Credit Union Board, St. Mary's Villa, the Saskatchewan-Manitoba Implement Dealers Association, and the Saskatchewan Real Estate Commission. Mr. Schmeiser drew international attention for his challenge against Monsanto that was addressed at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2004. Mr. Schmeiser is survived, and he is sadly missed, by his wife of 68 years, Louise, and their children, Mary Lou, Daniel, Mary Jane, John, and Anne-Marie, alongside each of their families. Mr. Speaker, I would move, in recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, that this Assembly express its most sincere sympathy to members of the bereaved family.
Will the members take the motion as read? Carried. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I rise to join the Premier in supporting this motion of condolences in the name of Percy Schmeiser, certainly a larger-than-life figure in our province. In fact, I confess my ignorance. I actually wasn't aware that he'd been an MLA, but his was a name that was known for many other reasons, and a name known around the world as someone who stood up against one of the major corporations and took a very, very challenging battle all the way to the Supreme Court, and even went on to have a film made about his story and his life. I don't know if he would have been happy it was made in Manitoba and not in Saskatchewan, but I'm sure it must have been quite an experience to see his story on the silver screen to be portrayed by Christopher Walken. But of course, he's more than that one story. This is someone who spent their entire life in Saskatchewan, was a leader in his community, a leader in Bruno, and an active voice around the world for the rights of farmers, the rights of farmers to determine their own future, to plant the crops they wanted to plant. So good for Mr. Schmeiser. Thank you for his service. And I ask everyone to give a good thought to Mr. Schmeiser, to Percy, to Louise, and their children as we pass this motion of condolences today.
Recognize the member from Humboldt-Watrous.
Mr. Speaker, and it's indeed my pleasure to join the Premier and the Leader of Opposition in giving condolences to the Schmeiser family. I had the pleasure, actually, of chatting with Percy and his wife, Louise, on many, many occasions. They lived the majority of their life just outside of Bruno, and that's where their farm was, and Percy took over the family farm as well as some family businesses, and he was very engaged in that community. So, of course, living most of my life in that area as well, and then, you know, having my final years in Humboldt, I would see Percy from time to time at functions or on the street or in a business. And, you know, he always had a few words to say, sometimes advice. Sometimes he would tell me what I was doing wrong, but sometimes he'd tell me what I was doing right as well. And we always had a great conversation, and I enjoyed each and every one of them. He remained his entire life very engaged in his community, and he also was very engaged in the political pulse of the province. He was very interested in community issues. He was very interested in provincial issues, and as was mentioned by the two previous gentlemen, that he was obviously very passionate about issues dealing with agriculture. He's been described by both previous speakers as larger than life, and I know, speaking to a neighbor about Percy, I won't name him, he just said, you know, he was quite the character. And indeed, Percy was quite the character. He had determination like no other, and obviously he was never afraid to weigh into very controversial issues and to put forward his views in a very, very passionate way. Percy was a very eloquent spokesperson, and he became such when he took on Monsanto in a well-known court case now that has become a movie. So it is indeed my pleasure to join the Premier in offering my condolences to the Percy Schmeiser family.
Recognize a member from Batoche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my condolences to the Schmeiser family. As a young man, I got to know Percy as our New Holland dealer, so there were bale wagons and balers, but what I really remembered one time, he was also the Burgo dealer, and we bought a big wing-type cultivator from Percy Schmeiser, and he delivered it. The thing is, it was a big wing-type cultivator, and he delivered it behind his half-ton. So I don't know if downhill it was the cultivator driving the half-ton, and uphill it was the half-ton driving the cultivator. So he swayed and swung, and he made it all the way to our place. So I remember that fondly. Mr. Speaker, Percy and his wife were very community-minded and tended a lot of functions. And at these functions, he always took time, and the two of us, well, usually his wife too, we would sit down and get a little visiting. So I'm grateful for those times to get to know him and hear the stories of his political life. So I would once again offer the family my condolences, and especially, Mr. Speaker, I know his son-in-law, a personal friend of mine, and I would say to Paul Revering, my condolences, and thank you.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Thomas Milton Weatherald, who passed away on July 23, 2019. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1964 until 1975. He represented the constituency of Cannington for the Liberal Party. Mr. Weatherald was born in 1937 on a family farm near Wawota. He received his Bachelor of Commerce degree in 1959 from the University of Saskatchewan, and at the age of 27, he was elected as a member of this Legislative Assembly. After serving as an MLA, he returned to farming in partnership with his brother. Tom was involved in many clubs and organizations in Wawota. He served as the chairman of both the Recreation Board and the Board of Directors of Deerview Lodge. He volunteered at the Wawota Curling Club and the baseball park and was a member of the Moose Mountain Water Advisory Board and the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation. He also loved playing and coaching baseball. For his commitment to the community and sport, Mr. Weatherald received the Saskatchewan Centennial Medal in 2005, and he was also inducted into the Saskatchewan Baseball Hall of Fame in 2007. Mr. Weatherald is survived and sadly missed by his wife of 50 years, Cheryl, as well as their children, Michael and Patrick, alongside their families. Mr. Speaker, I would move, in recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, that this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to members of the bereaved family.
Will the members take the motion as read? I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join the Premier in supporting this motion of condolence on the passing of Mr. Thomas Weatherald, elected as a very young man, 27 years old. That's quite a way to start off in your adult life in this House, and had a long career, 11 years here, then on to continue farming near his community of Wawota, a ball player and a coach, a community leader. We can understand how Mr. Weatherald would be sadly missed by his community and by his family. And we pass on our condolences to his wife Cheryl, their children Michael and Patrick, as we join in this motion of condolence on behalf of all those in the legislature today. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Cannington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege and an honour to rise and second the motion of condolences to the Weatherald family. I thank them for being in attendance today in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. I would like to offer my condolences publicly to the family of Thomas Weatherald. Tom was born and raised in the Wawota area of southeast Saskatchewan. He loved farming and was a true caretaker of the land he worked. A few short years after graduating from the University of Saskatchewan, Tom took up the challenge of public service. At the age of 27, he ran for the Liberals in the constituency of Cannington. This was the first of 3 consecutive victories for Tom in Cannington. After serving as MLA, he returned to the farm, a life he loved. Along with his wife Cheryl, he raised 2 sons, Michael and Patrick. As parents in rural Saskatchewan, they would have driven many miles across the province to get their kids to their sporting events and proudly watch them compete. Tom has left a lasting legacy in his home community and around the province. Thank you for your service.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would move that this Assembly records with great sorrow and regret the passing of a former member of this Assembly and expresses its grateful appreciation of the contribution that he made to his community, to his constituency, and to his province. Clinton Oliver White, who passed on December the 31st, 2020 at the age of 92. He was a member of this Legislative Assembly from 1978 until 1982, and he represented the constituency of Regina-Wascana for the New Democratic Party. Dr. White served on Executive Council as the Minister of Culture and Youth. Dr. White was born in Endeavour on December the 28th, 1928. Prior to becoming an MLA, he worked as a telegraph operator with the CNR. He then pursued his post-secondary education and he received his doctorate in 1968. Dr. White became a professor of history at Campion College here in Regina. This is where during his tenure he wrote Power for a Province, a history of Saskatchewan power. He retired from teaching in 1992. Mr. White is survived by numerous nieces and nephews, and he is sadly missed by his neighbours and his friends. In recording its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, this Assembly expresses its most sincere sympathy to the members of the bereaved family. I so move, Mr. Speaker.
Will the members take the motion as read? Carried. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join the Premier in supporting this motion of condolence on the passing of Clinton White. Dr. White was the member for Regina-Wascana for the New Democratic Party from 1978 until 1982. Started off his career as a telegraph operator, became a PhD and a professor of history at Campion College, and an author. His contributions to Saskatchewan were many, both within this House and outside it. I want to pass on our condolences to all those who knew Mr. White and grieve his loss, and thank the Assembly for this motion.
Recognize a member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure and privilege to rise today and pay tribute and offer condolences to Dr. Clinton White, a former member of this legislature for Regina-Wascana, who passed on New Year's Eve 2020, just 3 days after his 92nd birthday. And Mr. Speaker, upon rising, it's kind of routine and respectful to say that it's a privilege to rise here today and in this, the People's Legislature, but on occasions such as today, when we pause to reflect and listen and allow the memories and reputations and legacies of our forefathers to echo again in these halls and to attest to those upon whose shoulders we stand, it truly is a privilege. I know I'm thinking of the many who have passed through these warm and cavernous sound and study-filled halls, and I imagine every one of our members, and in this I truly mean all of us, felt and feel slightly hushed and slightly hollowed by the marble and the memories of this place and all those who have gone before us here. But Clint White was an NDP MLA from 1978 to 1982 here in the Queen City. Born in the Endeavour District, studious and bright, he left the family farm to pursue high school in Yorkton before, as noted, joined CNR for a decade, working diligently and passionately as a telegraph operator. While in Humboldt, he struck up a friendship with an Alma Schmeisser who worked at Humboldt's Depot Lunch Cafe. And eventually it became evident that despite being a regular customer, he was not just a regular customer. They were married in 1952 and lived in Humboldt for several years. Clint and Alma were self-described best friends for 68 years, and she predeceased him by just 6 months, passing on July 3rd, 2020, also at the age of 92. Thoughtful and clever and determined to better their lives, Clint left Humboldt to pursue studies,
obtaining numerous accolades and scholarships, which allowed a self-described poor farm boy from Yorkton Way to obtain a BA and MA, the MA from the University of Minnesota, and then ultimately a PhD from the University of Saskatchewan. Later in life, his social ethics and commitment to progress drew him to politics, though he served but one term. However, in that term, he served in cabinet as Minister for Culture and Youth, and prior to and following his time in the Assembly, Dr. White was an associate professor of history at Campion College, where he retired from in 1992. As a cabinet minister, he was described as insightful and competent, and up until very recently would still call into our caucus office from time to time and share his thoughts and have generous and engaging conversations on the issues of the day. And in addition to these many accomplishments, Dr. White wrote a definitive book on the history of SaskPower, which I borrowed from the Legislative Assembly and am currently reading. And now I didn't know Clint, nor do I believe I had the chance to meet him, although I may have door-knocked him in 2016 as he lived on Dark Crescent up until relatively recently. But what comes through in the writing in his book, beyond the clear and engaging prose, is an evident love of history, this province, and the decency of the man. The introduction notes and remembers everyone and thanks those from cabinet ministers and the head of SaskPower down to the typists and administrative assistants who helped in the production of the book, with, of course, a special note for his limitlessly patient best friend, Alma. As we serve in this legislature, may we all be so humble and considerate of those who support our dreams for a better province. People of this province and the many beloved neighbours and family members of Clint are thankful for his memory, his service, strength of character, and thorough decency that he brought to all endeavours in service to Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Premier.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This final condolence motion today is of someone that many of us in this Assembly had the opportunity to meet and to glean some of the experience that he was more than willing to share, and that is of the Honourable Thomas Malloy. Thomas Malloy led a life of commitment to his family, first and foremost to his vocation, and to his community, as well as to all people in his country. Tom Malloy seemed at ease as the Lieutenant Governor of this province. In fact, I would dare say that he was perfectly cast as Her Majesty's Vice-Regal representative here in this province. His honour had a very regal bearing about him. He carried himself with grace, and he carried himself with great dignity. And there was nothing more than a steadfast and steady poise about him. I was very fortunate to benefit from Mr. Malloy's guidance. At the funeral of his honour, I would point to Greg Pelzer, a family friend who passed along some of the life lessons from his honour. First, be humble, and don't take yourself too seriously. Second, always dress for the occasion, not for yourself, because other people matter. Have a good sense of humour. Remain a boy or girl at heart, because it's the simple things in life that most certainly matter the most. Love your children as meat does salt. Children are often the most important teachers that we will encounter in our life. This is excellent advice, and advice that was often offered by His Honour. Mr. Speaker, I was very proud to have the privilege of getting to know Mr. Malloy, and I am, as well as his family, his children, and I am very honoured to move the following motion. That this Assembly unite in paying tribute to the memory of the Honourable W. Thomas Malloy, the 22nd Lieutenant Governor of the Province of Saskatchewan, who passed on July the 2nd, 2019. He was born and raised in Saskatoon. He completed his law degree at the University of Saskatchewan, and he was called to the bar in 1965. His Honour had a distinguished legal career, and he had been called the modern father of Confederation for his work in treaty making and reconciliation with Indigenous people of Canada. He served as the chief federal negotiator for the creation of Nunavut, the Niska Final Agreement, the Inuit of Northern Quebec Offshore Agreement, and the Lahaidli-Tena and Sliammon Final Agreements, among many others. In addition to his career as a skilled lawyer and a negotiator, His Honour served as the Chancellor and Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Saskatchewan. He was an award-winning author who contributed extensively to the national and local organizations such as the Wanuskewin Heritage Park, Indigenous Works, the Forum for Young Canadians, the Canadian Landmine Foundation, the RCMP Heritage Centre, Habitat for Humanity Canada, the Kidney Research Foundation of Saskatchewan, and the Saskatoon Community Foundation, as well as many, many more. For his many outstanding accomplishments, he was appointed an officer of the Order of Canada in 1996, and he was invested into the Saskatchewan Order of Merit in 2012. On March the 21st, 2018, His Honour was sworn in as the 22nd Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, and it's during his tenure that he participated in hundreds of events, a sweat lodge, treaty gatherings, powwows, and many, many other special occasions. He served as a Lieutenant Governor until his passing. Mr. Speaker, I would move, in recording in its own deep sense of loss and bereavement, that this Assembly express its most sincere sympathy with members of the bereaved family.
Will the members take the motion as read? Carried. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It truly is an honour to rise in this House and join in a motion of condolence on the passing of His Honour Thomas Mulloy, the 22nd Lieutenant Governor of this great province. It was truly a special experience for all of us who were able to serve during the tenure of Mr. Mulloy. He brought to his service as Lieutenant Governor an incredible reputation as a leader, the terminology, a modern father of Confederation, for his work with the Niska Treaty and with the foundation of Nunavut. He was a widely known author, and I first came to know him actually when he was Chancellor at the university. His son-in-law, Elliot, was a medical school classmate of mine, and I got to know his wife, Catherine, and some of the rest of the Mulloy family through that time. And I think many of us might have been a little bit awed when he came in this role. This is someone with such an impressive track record that you might have thought he would be maybe a little bit aloof or difficult to approach, but quite the opposite. I truly valued the time, and the Premier and I, we don't always get along, but I remember some of those moments when it's you and the Premier and the Lieutenant Governor, and there's a moment of taking off those roles and understanding each other as people, and those are important and valuable moments. And His Honour really did establish that kind of feeling. He made you feel like you were important, he was interested in what you had to say, and that he had something to share. And it's hard to believe he served only for a little over a year, given the impression that he's left on our province, his incredible commitment to reconciliation, his leadership, and the role model that he was. He's left a lasting mark on our province and all those who are fortunate enough to serve during his tenure. And so I am honored to join all of our colleagues here today in passing condolences to his family and honoring the memory of our Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Mulloy.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask for leave to move a motion for transmittal.
Is leave granted? Granted is agreed.
Mr. Speaker, I would move that notwithstanding Rule 8(2) of the Rules and Procedures of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, the Speaker, on behalf of the Legislative Assembly, transmit copies of the official records of the tributes to the bereaved families in memory of the deceased members and the former Lieutenant Governor. I so move.
It has been moved by the Premier that notwithstanding Rule 8(2) of the Rules and Procedures of Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, the Speaker, on behalf of the Legislative Assembly, transmit copies of the official records of the tributes to the bereaved families in memory of the deceased members and former Lieutenant Governor. Is it a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved to adjourn the House. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House is now adjourned till 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.